Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, October 31st, so happy Halloween. Hope you all have big plans for trick-or-treating tonight. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by two folks who are in the state Department of Housing and Community Development and also in the Agency of Natural Resources, who are here to talk to us about a big topic that's become a lot larger for many of us since the flooding of July 9th and 10th of this past summer. And that's the question of resiliency. So we'll be talking about what that means today, what's involved with that. And on that, we're really pleased to have with us today Bronwyn Cook, who is the Community Planning and Policy Manager for the Community Planning and Revitalization with the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, and also Marion Wolves, who is the Climate Change, Resilience, and Adaptation Coordinator for the State Climate Action Office in the Agency of Natural Resources. Bronwyn, Marion, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Andrew. Thanks.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. It's been a subject I've been kind of quite fascinated with ever since the flooding that we saw back in early July. Impacted a lot of communities around the state very heavily, including a couple down this way, Weston and Londonderry, Ludlow are three that come to mind, as well as farther north where you folks are up in the Barre and Montpelier area. I've been hearing an awful lot about resiliency and kind of what that means and what we should be doing to further that since those flooding events. And I thought a good way for us to get started today might be to kind of maybe define our terms and kind of have you explain to us what is involved with resiliency, how we're doing with that, and what is it? I mean, is it mainly like sort of infrastructure related, you know, kind of flood-proofing floodplain areas in towns? Or is it also something broader that might include things like making sure we have reliable broadband or emergency shelters? Or maybe it's both.
Yeah, great question, Andrew. And I think it's all of those and more. And taking a step back, climate resilience is really defined as a state of readiness for individuals, communities, our natural and built systems to be able to face the risks posed to us by climate change. So it's really a space we're trying to be in and grow into that allows us to be better prepared to respond to and better recover quickly from climate stressors and shocks that are posed to us by a changing climate. You'll also often hear, and I'll throw this out there, the term climate adaptation, which goes hand in hand with the term of resilience. And sometimes you'll hear it interchange, but wanted to define that as well. And that the way I think of it, adaptation is really an action or a set of actions that help us reduce physical climate risk to our natural and built systems and infrastructure. So adaptation are actions that help us prepare to and really adjust to climate impacts and help us become more resilient to climate change. And to answer your question about, you know, does this include emergency shelters, reliable broadband, food support? It's really all of those things. And we can think about resilience in two broad categories, being able to sort of reduce our hard infrastructure and better preparing our infrastructure for to be able to respond and recover from hazards and risks, and then preparing people and enhancing social resilience so that our communities are better able to respond and to recover quickly from climate change. And all of those components that you spoke to are kind of included in that broad category of climate resilience and adaptation.
So I'm sure resiliency and building resiliency has been kind of part and parcel of all the state's efforts, certainly ever since Irene. Tropical storm Irene back in August of 2011. But that seems to have taken on a much greater emphasis and importance since the flooding events that we saw in July. Does that sound right? I mean, it seems like there's a much greater attention being paid to that in connection with, you know, climate change, especially that we weren't seeing before.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we're seeing what we've been talking about with climate change, which is that it's not just going to be, one big storm every 100 years or every 500 years. We've seen multiple really large storms within a short period of time. So I think that really has elevated the conversation in a way to kind of focus on the fact that we need to start thinking about what the future climate conditions are going to look like, and not just planning for our past, but planning for what climate is going to look like in the future. So we have seen that conversation shift quite a bit. The energy elevates quite a bit once a disaster has happened. And I think the challenge is to keep that energy in the conversation, even as some communities are recovering from a flood, working with other communities who maybe weren't impacted by these floods to say, how can we prepare ourselves so that we can mitigate those impacts for the next flood that might hit another area of Vermont.
And one thing I'll add just to that, and I think to set the context too for this conversation, the flooding in July is fresh in our minds, is the conversation we're having today. But we've really had a summer of direct climate impacts on Vermont, not just from flooding. So if you throw your mind back to early May, we had an unseasonably warm beginning of May, followed by a hard frost that really impacted a lot of apple crop and other farmers in the state, not because of the hard frost. That's pretty normal in mid-May to have a frost, but that it followed 2 weeks of really warm weather. And to borrow a term from the Vermont state climatologist, she refers to that as a backward spring, and is an impact of climate change we'll continue to see more, where we have warmer weather followed by some unseasonably cold weather that could impact our agricultural community. Following that, we were actually in a drought, which is hard to remember given all the rain we've had in the past couple of months, but northern Vermont was placed into a D1 sort of categorization called a moderate drought, which is one of the earliest drought ratings we've had in the state. And then following that, I think of this summer, when I remember this summer, it was either raining or we were dealing with wildfire smoke from the wildfires up in Quebec. And that's going to continue to be more of an impact as the climate warms. We will see both more precipitation, but areas of drought and long-term drying, which will impact wildfires in our area. So all of that together really paints a picture of why this conversation of resilience is so important to have, and why it's really becoming upfront as a part of the conversation following this flooding, but reflecting back on the other events of this summer as well.
What do you think are going to be the biggest challenges with building enhanced resilience that we're going to need now if indeed climate events like Irene or this flooding, instead of these once every 100-year floods, we know they're once every 5 or 10 years, or even less than that, or other climate events like you just mentioned are going to be more common. I mean, it seems to me that it's great to talk about building back better, improving things, and building greater resiliency, but that also implies that it's going to cost more too, and it'd be more expensive. And I would imagine you're probably gearing up for some of the struggles to finance some of those stronger enhancements that we're going to need if we're going to safeguard communities that are in vulnerable areas.
Yeah, yes, there's going to be a cost involved, but I think one of the more interesting questions that we're asking and starting to dig into is, what's the cost if we don't do anything? If we're not planning for floods or any other climate impact that's now happening more frequently, the cost of recovery, the economic losses and the cost of recovery are big. So what's the cost if we don't do anything? There's a lot of questions to answer in there, and Agency of Natural Resources is just starting to undertake some analysis to look at sort of the cost-benefit analysis around preventative measures that reduce those impacts of climate, trying to figure out what kind of investments do we want to make that help reduce our future costs from climate impacts.
Right. And to follow up on what Bronwyn was saying, particularly when it comes to thinking about investment in adaptation actions that sort of help build our resilience to climate change. You can almost think of it as insurance, because you want to invest in a space in an action that helps you reduce future losses, but we don't know what those future losses will be. And so to sort of think about it in a way where we need to invest to decrease potential future losses or sort of defer damages from future events, but we don't know exactly what the frequency of those will be. But as Bronwyn said, we're starting to think about how can we actually value what investments are needed in resilience adaptation statewide, what steps communities can take, and what the predicted or potential deferred damages or savings will be in the long run to be able to make that case for investment, because we know it's needed, and we know it's needed at all scales within the state. But how to really make that case to decision makers is key. And then I think the other thing I'll say is with the flooding, there's a lot of comparisons to Irene, to a lot of steps that the state took to change sort of how we build back bridges and transportation infrastructure. And we did see, a much smaller number of bridges and sort of road washouts from this storm than we did in Tropical Storm Irene. But the damage amounts are, in terms of sort of the FEMA calculated public infrastructure damages, are pretty comparable, if not higher, than what we saw in Tropical Storm Irene. With that, and this is a component of FEMA infrastructure funding, and sort of disaster recovery funding, we also get a percentage of that funding that comes to the Vermont Division of Emergency Management to pay out through hazard mitigation grants, which allows communities to sort of take steps to prevent future disaster, to elevate, to buy out homes, to restore floodplains, to size up bridges and culverts in a way that allows us to sort of build back to a degree that's really needed, knowing that we're going to have these more frequent storms. So it's both a question of cost and knowing that we need to invest in that space, and then also understanding where those funds are coming from, and sort of how that relates to the work that we've done and are going to continue to do for this.
In your conversations with local officials that you may have had, from different parts around the state, some of which saw direct impacts from weather events, and some which may have been fortunate enough to avoid them. Do you get a sense that they kind of get it, that, hey, we're in a different era now, and they need to be more focused on doing things like fixing culverts that may be aging out, or just some of those kind of under the radar type stuff, but that is the one, are the other measures that kind of keep bad rainstorms from being not disasters, that there is a consensus out there that, yeah, we need to do this, and we're going to have to spend some money to do it.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting, as I think Bronwyn said, we're in a space now where we've had a recent disaster that has impacted a lot of communities, and for better or for worse, a lot of community conversations are happening around sort of what do we need short term to help our downtowns, our folks whose homes were flooded out, help folks get back into safe, affordable housing, help businesses get back to their day-to-day operations, but also those long-term conversations around acknowledging that a lot of Vermont's development pattern has been along river corridors. What does that mean for our downtowns and businesses? I think I've been hearing, and it's nice also that this is happening in a time where we can often, sit in on those conversations on Zoom as we're having now, and sort of be able to hear what communities are grappling with, and be able to sort of reflect on the themes we're hearing across conversations. And there are a lot of reflections on, we know this is going to continue to happen more frequently. How do we sort of change our thinking around not just building back the way we were, but building back to a place where we are more resilient to climate change? So I would say, yes, that is coming up a lot more in conversation. It's how to actually do that, and how to find the funding to do that, and sort of the key components of the conversation and decision making at a community level are still conversations that folks are having and wrestling with. But certainly hearing that reflected in a lot of community conversations about how do we sort of change our thought process around ensuring that our infrastructure, our people, our natural communities are built back in a way that's more resilient.
Yeah, and I'll just add that to some extent, this is what communities are always grappling with. If it's, prior to climate, it was COVID. And so some of the things that we need to do, really bringing communities along in being engaged in some of the things that are impacting their communities. It's the same kind of work. It's taking some time and effort to talk to a community, hear their ideas, hear people out, build social connection, build trust, build understandings of what the challenges are, and come up with a plan that the community can get behind to improve their community and address some of these challenges and strengthen these communities, whether it's COVID or whether it's climate impacts. Some of it's the same work. So they're familiar with this work. And what we're hearing is a lot of communities just saying, we need a little support, whether it's some planning funds or some consultant support, or knowing that implementation dollars are going to be there so that it makes sense for us to take on this work, because we'll actually be able to implement some of the recommendations that come out. So we're hearing from a lot of communities that it's familiar to them, with a different sort of lens, and still just need some support and some dollars to help them do the work.
One of the interesting issues that I've been hearing about is the whole question of downtowns that, towns that were built along rivers historically, back in the 1800s and even earlier for that matter. They were built along rivers because that was the avenues of commerce. And now a lot of those downtowns are built in what are effectively, I guess, floodplains or flood-prone areas. I guess I just wondered, is building sufficient resilience going to involve sort of evacuating some of those areas that were historic downtowns and moving them a little bit farther away from rivers, or is there a pathway to resilience that involves like building barriers up along riverbanks so that they don't overflow as easily and don't flood out those low-lying downtown areas quite as badly?
Yeah, it's going to be both, most likely. It's also going to be really place-based. I think one of the cautions that I have is around some terms that are often used, like managed retreat or evacuating communities. Yes, our communities, our historic downtowns where we've built all this infrastructure and have a lot of buildings, have our sort of economic hubs or community hubs, they are along rivers. But I do think that there's opportunity and space to work within those existing communities to ease off the rivers in some places, allow the river to maybe follow its more natural path, allow for some space for floodwaters to go without flooding our downtowns. But it's not, I don't think we're at a point yet where we're talking about, having to completely move some of our entire downtown areas, right? I don't think we've exhausted all of our options just yet in terms of making some space in communities, but also hardening in some ways. Everybody's heard of some basic things like moving equipment out of the basements, perhaps, that can protect our investment and allow water to come in every 20 years, every 30 years, every 100 years, without completely having to rebuild all of our electrical or heating infrastructure in the basement. It just, allows the water to flow through when it's going to, but it doesn't completely disrupt our way of life, or it doesn't cost a ton to recover from that. So yeah, I think we're not at the point yet. I think we can make space. Some properties, we may need to buy out some properties and move them to other places in the community that are more flood safe, particularly housing. But I think, we're not abandoning our downtowns and villages.
And one other thing I think together with that question of how to help downtowns where we've sort of historically settled, the economic drivers of our communities be better prepared and be more resilient to climate change, is sort of expanding that question to think about, at a watershed level or, upstream from those communities are potentially areas where we can, use nature-based solutions. So really restoring our natural communities, ecological areas to better store water at those headwater areas that actually reduces the level of flooding in downtown areas that may be downstream. So we need to be thinking about it not just at the place where we sort of have that physical infrastructure, but together with the stream as sort of a living body, and understanding, what is upstream that we could potentially use some strategies to conserve land, to decrease floodwaters from future flooding that maybe impacts our downtowns. And one example of that is the Whetstone Brook in Brattleboro. There was a study done after Irene to look at, conserving a particular parcel of land upstream from Brattleboro that would actually reduce floodwaters from a large storm 4 to 5 feet in the downtown area. And there's been a lot of work to identify this particular parcel that I believe is a logging yard, and restoring that floodplain, restoring that parcel. The owner of the logging yard was able to sell it, and there's partners working on that project. And it's been a multi-year process, but engineering review has found that by restoring that particular parcel to floodplain to allow the river to access that floodplain, it will significantly reduce flooding in downtown Brattleboro by 4 to 5 feet, which it should be a conversation we're thinking about, both in terms of the infrastructure and sort of what's needed at those downtown locations, but also how can we partner those strategies with conservation of headwaters and other places that maybe is a little bit more of a broader approach with our community conversations.
I wonder if we could maybe zoom out a little bit for a moment and talk about the climate action plan, I guess, that the Agency of Natural Resources has developed. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. What does that involve, and how does that apply to this whole resiliency conversation?
Yeah, so the Climate Action Plan is the state's first climate action plan. It was adopted in December of 2021 by the Vermont Climate Council. And it's a plan that's mandated through the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which passed in late 2020. That established a Vermont Climate Council, required the Climate Council to write a climate action plan that had a number of stipulations and update that plan every 4 years. And the requirements of the plan include both a number of requirements around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions that were goals that the state had on the books for more than a decade. The Global Warming Solutions Act turned those into statutory requirements, and the plan details the steps and actions and investments needed in order to meet those greenhouse gas reductions. But the Global Warming Solutions Act also requires the Climate Action Plan to think about how do we help communities, natural, human, and our infrastructure build resilience to climate change. What are the steps that are needed? And details thinking about smart growth strategies, thinking about using nature-based solutions, thinking about equity and ensuring that communities that are more disadvantagedly impacted from climate change are able to be sort of brought along and their voices held up in this process. So it's a really comprehensive requirement both for the Climate Action Plan and the Vermont Climate Council to meet. And that first plan was adopted, as I said, in December of 2021. So the plan it's a large document. It includes a number of 274, I believe, actions that cover all of those categories that I mentioned: reducing our emissions, thinking about adaptation and resilience in our natural spaces and our built environment and our communities, and then also strategies to sequester and store carbon in our natural spaces. So sort of that three-legged stool of climate action: mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration. And the Climate Action Plan speaks to all of those. And it's a multi-stakeholder implementation plan. So it doesn't just fall to ANR, it really falls to all of state government and folks outside of state government to help implement, and serves as a roadmap to the state and the legislature for action on climate change. In terms of how we're doing on that, again, a number of actions are being implemented from the plan. The plan, for example, recommended the creation of a climate action office, which is where I sit now, and a number of other strategies that help with, again, reducing our emissions and building adaptation and resilience in this space, and speaks a lot to the strategies we've just been discussing around using nature-based solutions, equipping local communities with the planning and project implementation support they need to be able to take action on climate change, and then specifics around additional analyses that may be needed to help in that decision making as well. So it's really a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector approach to how we reduce our emissions and adapt to climate change broadly. That plan is updated every 4 years, so we're actually gearing up for an update that's due in July of 2025, which feels pretty close, considering it feels like we just adopted the plan a couple of years ago. And that will be done, ANR supports the Climate Council in that work, as does Agency of Commerce and Community Development and other state partners. But it's the Climate Council's plan and sort of roadmap to how we adapt and reduce our emissions from climate change.
Yeah, because that's sort of really the big picture or the long-term outlook that we need to be thinking about, as well as the short-term issues of building resilience now or this year or next year. Because if we don't do both, I guess we're kind of defeating the whole purpose. We just have a couple of minutes left, and before we have to go, I just wondered, are there going to be federal resources available to help move this along, or is this going to have to be kind of worked through just by Vermonters itself?
Yes, federal resources, both in terms of immediate flood recovery, FEMA dollars that are coming through, but we're also seeing some indication that there's just more investment from the federal level for general climate resilience work and projects. So getting those dollars means we need to put in some effort to be ready to take them up. What projects do we want to do? Do we have our partners in place to be able to implement those projects? I will say that federal dollars are probably not going to cover everything. So there's going to be need for state investment as well. And there's going to be need for down to the municipal level, thinking about capital planning to make sure that, we were accounting for some of these future costs and making sure that it's sort of wrapped into our regular operations. One of the projects that I wanted to mention really quick, Marion had touched on some of the implementation work that came out of this, but after Irene, there was a project called the Vermont Economic Recovery Initiative, and it was focused on getting communities together to talk about what kind of projects do they want to see implemented to recover from Irene, but also improve future resilience. Some of the projects that Marion talked about were exactly those projects that came out of that very program, and were really impactful in having shovel-ready projects for when federal dollars became available. That's a program that we are looking to sort of resurface again. It's going to have a different name this time around. I think it's going to be called Rivers, but those funds are really important to help communities prepare for and develop the kinds of projects that are ready for when federal dollars do become available to us. And then there's, as I was mentioning, I think when we started, a lot of the focus may be on communities that were impacted by these floods, but we know that there's a lot of work to do in other communities who may be impacted by future floods, may be impacted by other climate impacts like heat or drought or wildfire or any of the other impacts that might come from climate change. And we need to be doing and investing in the work to plan for those kinds of things as well. So yes, federal money will be coming along, but I think we need to be prepared as well to identify gaps in that and invest state funds in the places where federal money is not reaching.
You raise a good point that we all think back about the floods in July, but as you mentioned, there's all kinds of things that could happen that would be out of the ordinary, like the heat wave or smoke from fires from wherever, and that's all part of the whole issue. A really complicated problem. I guess I just wondered, last question real quick. Is your advice to local select boards and town officials sort of hey guys, be thinking about this stuff now and be ready when the money does become available, or if there's a grant opportunity, that it would be a good idea to kind of think about, well, what should we be doing, or maybe even like a wish list kind of thing of if we had the money to do X, Y, or Z, how would we do that? Is that a conversation that's starting to happen with town officials that in the past, I guess, were probably going, one step at a time instead of kind of thinking where we might want to be 5 or 10 years down the road?
Yeah, I think, and as we talked about a little bit earlier, the flooding this summer and the other climate, stressors and impacts we felt this summer are really bringing climate change to the forefront of conversations with planning commissions and select boards and sort of general community conversations. And so, yes, I would say, in conversations, talking to your select board, when thinking about infrastructure investments or capital planning or renovations that are maybe needed to, a municipally owned building, ensuring that you're thinking about climate change potential impacts, vulnerabilities, and then how to kind of build resilience into that conversation should be, part and parcel of all of our conversations at a municipal level, because we're going to be seeing these types of impacts more frequently. We're going to be seeing them, in some cases, become more severe. And so it shouldn't just be one conversation that one group is having, but rather it should be folded into planning processes, project implementation, decision making at all levels of government. And we're thinking about, how do we as state agencies provide guidance and sort of resources to municipalities to help with those conversations and help with that decision making. And so in the Climate Action Office, we're developing a mapping tool that will help communities sort of better explore and understand their vulnerabilities to climate change, looking at, social infrastructure, built infrastructure, biophysical environments, and then overlaying with climate hazard data where we have it. We're also thinking about how do we, municipalities do so many different types of plans. They write municipal plans, hazard mitigation plans, thinking about transportation, capital planning. How do we connect all of that existing planning work into a sort of guidance document that helps communities see where climate resilience can fit into those conversations? So it's not in addition to, but rather just becomes part of the conversation. Because it's no longer climate change is in the future. Climate change impacts are happening to us now and need to really be key and part of the conversation in all spaces.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Bronwyn.
I was just going to say in DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, one of the things that we're also working on is we run programs that provide incentives and support for communities to revitalize their downtown areas and their villages. And now, obviously, we're trying to encourage through those incentive programs for those downtown and villages to start thinking about climate. What does it look like to have their communities be more resilient to climate change, maintain that sort of robust economic center that provides so much to all of Vermonters. So it's being incorporated into some of our programs as well, in thinking about what kind of incentives can we provide to ensure that our investments are also being wise towards climate impacts.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for today. This is a fascinating subject, which I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about in coming weeks, months, years, decades. Really, I want to thank you both for making the time to be with us today. Bronwyn Cook of the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, and Marion Walls, who with the Agency of Natural Resources. Thank you both very much for sharing your insights and knowledge on this whole area, which, again, I'm sure will be an ongoing subject of conversation for many of us for quite a while to come. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today. I hope you found our program interesting. And, we'll see you again the next time. And like I said at the top, happy Halloween.